Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Amy Stuart Wells, Professor of Sociology and Education and the Coordinator of Policy Studies at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her research and writing focuses on issues of race and education, specifically on educational policies such as school desegregation, school choice, charter schools, and how they shape and constrain opportunities for students of color. Wells is the 2016-17 Wayne Morse Chair of Law and Politics. She will give a public lecture titled Our Children's Burden, How Public Education Helps Sustain a Diverse Democracy on October 18th, 2016. Thank you, Amy, for coming on the show.
Thank you.
How did your own experience as a student lead you to this career and this interest?
Well, I mostly attended segregated schools, meaning predominantly white, almost all white schools throughout my career as a student. And that did have an influence on me in terms of what I was missing and what I was not prepared to do as an adult. And in particular, I lived in the South in the late 60s, where I attended an elementary school that admitted one black student who happened to be in my classroom in 4th grade. And that really influenced the reaction of the adults, the reaction of other students to her presence, I think had a profound, lasting impact on my way of making sense of race in America.
What kind of impacts has the changing demographics of the United States had on public education at the K through 12 level? What's it in the past 20 years? I mean, how's it different now than when you were a student?
Well, as of fall 2014, white non-Hispanic students are in a minority, or less than 50% of the total student population in public education. And I think there's several ways in which that's had an impact on the system, many of which we don't talk about and we haven't grappled with. I think in a positive light, it's pushed our educational system to think more broadly about culture and knowledge. On a more negative impact, I think it's lessened a lot of the public support for public education because I think it's difficult for an aging white population to be as supportive of a public institution when the students going to that school look different than they do. I mean, we know that from research and history. And so I think it's lessened our public will to support public education, and that's the very thing I'm working on.
So I know from your work that the response of K through 12 public education to these changing demographics and to the diversification of the American student population is quite different than the response of higher education to the changing demographics of the United States. Tell us about that distinction. What's different about the way these two systems have responded to these changes?
Well, in K through 12 education, we had an era where we were dismantling Jim Crow and de jure segregation, or state-enforced segregation. And that only took us so far, in large part because of the Milliken decision in 1974, which said you can't apply desegregation court orders across district boundaries. So as we all know, particularly those of us who live in the Northeast and the Midwest, many district boundaries are very small. And segregation now occurs more frequently between than within these district boundaries. So that as of 1974, the extent to which we could create desegregated schools was limited by the Supreme Court. And so there's a very little window of time when we actually implemented desegregation policy from 1968 to 74, and then some cases for intra-district desegregation after that. Whereas in higher ed, the push for affirmative action, which is kind of the analogy to desegregation, has carried on, and the jurisprudence and the legal strategies used for higher education have evolved and developed and become more strategic in responding to the changing courts, and research has played a very important role in that. In K through 12, once we kind of hit that barrier and we started to see more segregation happen between districts in a way that could not be addressed by the courts, and then the politics and policy shifted further away from that as a goal, we've gone in a very different direction.
So why have policymakers abandoned the goal of racially integrated K through 12 schools? I mean, I thought Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate schools are inherently unequal.
Right.
So what's happened? What has changed in policy at K through 12 that's allowed this segregation to grow?
Well, I think the history of American public education, K through 12, is part of this in the sense of it's very local, it's very locally controlled, it's geographically based. So when you have segregated housing across these small district boundaries, it's very difficult to overcome that, particularly after the Millikan decision. And so I think the political pushback on anyone messing with those boundaries or student attendance was very different in K through 12 than in higher ed, where you have some sense of a meritocratic system, some sense of an argument for that the universities can define how to create educational communities within higher ed. With K through 12, it's really more neighborhood based. So the politics moved away from addressing those issues of segregation, and at the same time, we started developing many policies oriented towards testing and accountability, shifting from a K through 12 policy orientation focused on inputs and equalizing inputs is the simple way we talk about it, and focus more on outcomes, which is not a bad thing in and of itself, except the narrow measures we were using to judge the outcomes, which is mainly standardized tests.
So the logic of this outcome-based approach is that this is a kind of colorblind way of making these evaluations, and the way we're going to address inequities in educational quality is we're going to find where the good schools are because of the performance of the students on tests, and then we'll use school choice or charter schools to get these underprivileged kids into these schools.
Or measures, kind of punitive measures used towards educators to try to encourage them to raise test scores in low-performing schools.
So I take it in your view those strategies haven't achieved their goals?
No.
So what has been the actual effect of those policies which were aimed at addressing this inequality or lack of equity across these schools that have, especially the schools where lower income minority students have now, in effect we have resegregation?
Well, it starts with the measures that we're using. It's not bad in and of itself to say we're going to look at student outcomes and try to equalize those. But when you're putting a lot of weight on one measure, basically standardized tests, which if we study the history of standardized testing in K through 12, not only is there a strong correlation between different racial groups with whites and Asians performing highest on those tests, which relates to a lot of cultural issues, ways of understanding curriculum, and then a lot of background issues often related to poverty. So it's not so much that we push the policy world towards focusing on outcomes, it's that we then use outcomes very, very narrow. We define them very narrowly. So that's had an impact on the system because then we define schools and children as good or bad, high achieving or low achieving, without looking at multiple ways of thinking of achievement, including other ways of expression and artistic expression, writing, and so there's a lot of pieces of the curriculum that have been pushed aside, and we're only using these tests. So that has then led to these definitions of different schools that are racialized and based on students' income, and then that just reinforces the patterns of housing segregation, the patterns of choice that happen, so that families with more resources and more access to the good schools have gravitated towards those.
So in your work you make a distinction between the model of school choice that most often gets talked about in American policy and in the public media, which you describe as a market-driven model. And you offer as an alternative a democratic model of school choice. What's the difference in your view between this market-driven and democratic model, and why is the democratic model better?
Well, the history of school choice policy in American education goes way, way back. And I always talk about choice as a means and not an end. And so we've used choice to maintain segregation when we created, white flight academies or allowed white students to choose white schools. We've used it as a means of desegregation, creating magnet schools and minority to majority transfer plans to allow students of color to transfer into predominantly white schools. And now more recently we've used it as a competitive means. So, and that's the market model. So that's kind of, it's very deregulated. And the way it's interacted with the system of unequal education is that it's exacerbated many of those inequalities. And so a more democratic model would be moving towards thinking of public education as an institution for all students, and so that we're not trying to compete against each other across schools. We are trying to work together in a more collaborative sort of way. So education is a very student-centered field, and so there's a lot of collaboration and goodwill that comes from working with children and helping children prosper that's been somewhat undermined by this more competitive way of thinking of schools as being pitted against each other, competing for students in a way that's made the system more unequal and has been damaging, I think, to our profession in terms of sharing knowledge and strategies across schools.
Because they feel that if we share this knowledge with a lesser school, it will compete against us, and that will put us at risk.
We see educators all the time scared that they're going to lose students because not because they aren't doing great things in their classroom, but because of different strategies that have been used in marketing and different techniques and outreach. So that makes them focus inward and not outward to a greater sense of community in terms of the city or the district, and kind of wanting to feel like they have to hide from their colleagues in other schools and not work with them. And we know that in the field of education we learn our best strategies by collaborating, working together. When the charter school movement started, part of the idea was that it was going to create some best practices that could then be filtered back into our regular public schools. And that, for the most part, has not happened at all. And that's because of the way in which charter schools were framed as being in competition with. So it's not very often in the business world, for example, that you share your best secrets with your competitor. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think our field is very much based on that kind of sharing and supporting all children and a more nurturing environment.
So just as you've talked about this democratic model of choice as opposed to a market-driven model, you've also talked about the distinction between a strategy of school desegregation on the one hand and a strategy that's more oriented toward integration. Mm-hmm. Why is integration a necessary component and desegregation is insufficient?
Well, what we've learned from our history, I think, is three things. One, that separate is inherently unequal. Desegregation is necessary but not sufficient, and integration should be the goal. And integration is really about students not just being in the same building together, but integration is really about how students learn from each other. And to do that well, what we've learned from our work at Teachers College and a new summer institute we've created is that will require kind of rethinking what we think of as intelligence, what we think of as ability, what we think of as rigorous curriculum, to include different ways of knowing and different ways of understanding and better cross-cultural knowledge, and really preparing students to cross cultural boundaries in a way they never have before, in a way they don't learn just focusing on their own test scores and their own individual knowledge, but sharing knowledge and sharing space. And that's exactly the argument universities have made around why they need diverse student bodies and why there's an educational benefit to that. It's what many U.S. corporations are saying they want in employees, is workers who can cross these boundaries, who can work collaboratively, who can learn from other people, rethink their own assumptions by listening to other people's perspectives, and instead of just thinking I have the right or wrong answer, which is kind of the testing mentality. And I'm not saying we don't need any testing, but when you only learn that way and you're only trying to get yourself ahead as opposed to working more collaboratively, it's a problem in terms of how you come out of school. And so, and how you live in a diverse democracy.
Now, this benefit of living in a diverse democracy, and the future workplace, and the need, that this is going to be a diverse workplace, our students should have exposure to diversity. But I understand there's also social science research that shows that students that are in diverse classrooms, there are measurable educational benefits for them. So tell us a little bit about that.
Right, so several measures, several major studies in psychology, social psychology, have shown several benefits to students, just in terms of broadening their understanding of the material, again, challenging their assumptions so that even if they don't change their mind, they're better versed in supporting their arguments. It broadens their way of understanding a problem and an issue. And even for, so for students in the majority groups, so say for white students in particular, this work that we're hearing now a lot around the Black Lives Matter movement, around implicit bias, they've actually found that that can inhibit your own learning if you are the holder of the bias. So it's not just that you're the recipient of the bias or the victim of it, it's also for those who carry around these biases. It inhibits you from learning and understanding things because you're so worried about these categorizations. So some of the most interesting work, I think, is showing how students overcoming these biases, how it helps them grow and develop and learn and move forward.
What are some of the kinds of programs in schools that can help create the kind of diverse learning environments that you're talking about? Do you have any examples of schools that are doing these things? What are these things they're doing, and how are the implementation of these kinds of practices working out?
We're working with several schools now in New York, and there are pockets of schools and classrooms all over the country of people doing this work. But it really begins with an intentional anti-racist curriculum. And it begins with a teacher and students really keeping race very visible in the curriculum and in how they're studying, and talking about different ways of learning and understanding material that they're covering, and how to learn from each other best. So using different strategies, cooperative learning, intergroup instruction, where students are problem solving together in a way that's not one student doing the whole problem, but actually students drawing on each other's knowledge, skills, and understandings to complete different tasks and assignments. And it's very powerful when it happens. It's very complicated to do from a teacher's perspective, and teachers really need support in doing that, particularly coming out of this era of testing, where it's really just more about testing, prepping students for tests at an individual level, having them work more collaboratively. So we were doing this work in this country back in the 70s. Stanford had a big program on intergroup relations. And we were actually, the multicultural education movement grew out of that. So we were making great gains in terms of the curriculum and pedagogy for racially diverse schools. And then along came several policy changes that kind of undermined the very mechanisms that created diverse schools, and shifted everything much more towards standardized testing.
So tell us about the programs that you're involved with, the Teachers College, that are trying to address this.
So we launched in 2016 a summer institute on teaching and learning in racially diverse schools, and we called it Reimagining Education, because it requires the educators who come to that to really rethink a lot of assumptions about who's smart and who's not, based on test scores and the data we've been putting in front of them all the time. And to rethink curriculum in an anti-racist way, in a not a colorblind way, but a race-conscious way. And a lot of that, so that was a combination of working on teachers' own racial identity. 80% of teachers in this country are white, and less than 50% of the students are white. So there is a mismatch. Teachers realize that. A lot of them are working hard on trying to improve that, and they realize at the Summer Institute they need to do their own work on their own whiteness and their own way of understanding and interacting with students of color. And then there were workshops with hands-on strategies for what to do in the classroom across grade levels and different subject matters. The other project that we're doing is called The Public Good. It's a public school support organization, a PSSO. And we are working with several racially diverse schools in Brooklyn right now, where gentrification's happening. So a lot of white families are moving in. Schools that were black and or Latino or some combination are now suddenly becoming predominantly white. PTAs that were run by Latino mothers are now being kind of taken over by the white gentrifying parents. So we're working with the school communities on this interracial understanding, and we're using systematic research to help parents in particular, and also educators, understand assumptions about children related to race, and helping them develop curricular strategies for working on that.
So, I mean, the demographic shift that you've just described, that is to say, the in-migration of whites who had been for 40 years in the suburbs, now back into the urban core.
Right.
Gentrification. Portland, Oregon is the fastest gentrifying city in America.
Wow.
And then a related shift is now the out-migration of people of color into the suburbs.
Yes.
It does seem like under a certain version of these trends, this could be an opportunity for increased diversity. But it also seems like that, correct me if I'm wrong, that is in fact not what's happening. That is to say there's just a sort of relocation of segregated communities.
Right.
Are there strategies that are being used to try to address that?
Well, that's a good question. In New York City, we are talking a lot about it at the school level. And there is some work through the New York City Department of Ed to redraw boundary lines, to allow pilot schools to do admissions policies that create more diverse student bodies. And there is an effort to create more affordable housing because it's so tied to the housing and the development going on in Brooklyn in particular, and Harlem, in those two places in particular. So it's there is an effort. There's not enough people talking across the housing school boundary lines, looking at the housing school nexus. In the suburbs, there are some suburbs that we are working with outside of New York that are trying to, in a way, indirectly stem any white flight from their schools by trying to frame their schools as diverse and the benefits of that for students. That's a nascent movement. And there's some realtors in some of those suburbs that we're starting to tap into and work with who are also framing these communities as diverse and therefore not in terms of white flight happening from these communities where you see property values fall, but as diversity as an asset that would maintain property values and draw families who want diverse communities to them. And the schools are an important part of that. So there's a lot of work to be done. We call these kind of de facto sites of integration or desegregation as these demographics are changing, and working to stabilize those communities, whether they're urban school districts or suburban schools, is really important. But also working with people on housing is key.
So you mentioned before that the majority of public school teachers are white and the majority of the students are not. And you mentioned strategies being adopted among white public school teachers to try to be more responsive to these trends and to the reality of their students' experience. Are there initiatives in schools of education like Teachers College that are working to increase the pipeline of teachers of color?
Absolutely. And I think that's been a trend in the field for a long time. But there are a lot of forces working against that, as you can imagine. But I think it's an ongoing effort among teacher education programs, and it definitely should be. But I also think that given how skewed the demographics are between the teaching force and the student bodies, that we need to also work on working with white teachers to do this work. And there's some fabulous white teachers who work with students of color and do an amazing job because they've done this work and they've thought they care about these issues. They're not colorblind. They don't pretend to be.
So say a little bit about the charter school movement. Is that been an effective response to these kind of problems?
To the problems of segregation? No, in fact, charter schools are more segregated than public schools, if you can imagine how that could be. And there's several policy reasons why that happens, the way they do their outreach, the way they structure their curriculum, really targeting towards different communities, and the lack of transportation that they provide to students. So, and then I just think the whole choice, laissez-faire mechanism of student assignment and enrollment that is exacerbated when you have many charter schools in an area perpetuates segregation. For the most part, the charter school movement, not completely, but and less so in the West than the East, has been targeted towards low-income communities of color and really focused on raising test scores in a pretty structured, disciplined environment. which many parents gravitate to and want and see the test scores as being very important to their students' success in the educational system and the way the educational system is constructed now. That's very true. So you can understand why more affluent families whose students score well on these tests without a lot of test prep, for the cultural reasons I mentioned before, are not as attracted to those schools above and beyond the racial issue and racial segregation. So it's actually perpetuated segregation. It's also offering, I think, very separate and unequal kinds of curriculum and teaching for students. And it's all kind of under this umbrella of judging schools and students almost exclusively based on tests.
And this is presented as a kind of colorblind evaluation approach.
Yes. Testing has an interesting history in this country that is presumably colorblind, even though we all actually realize that it's not. So
we've just got a couple of minutes left. This will probably be the last question. As the Morse chair, one of the things that you will do is teach a class, co-teach a class in the College of Education here at UO. Tell us about that class. What's going on in there? So
I'm co-teaching with Professor Joanna Good, and it's a sociology of education class, which goes from Durkheim and amazing sociological theorists who've thought about the field of education and its role in society to very contemporary issues such as the ones we've been talking about around colorblind education policy, and how you really need a sociological lens to grapple with where we are today and how we should move forward. So it's very interdisciplinary, very helpful, I think, in terms of thinking about policy and legal strategies for moving forward, but also grounded in a strong disciplinary focus on social contexts of learning in schools.
Is this an undergrad class, a graduate class?
It's a graduate class.
A graduate class. And are you teaching the class yet?
No, Thursday.
Oh, Thursday is the first day. Well, good luck with the class.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. Good luck with your lecture. And I really appreciate you coming to talk to us.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I've been speaking with Amy Stuart Wells, Professor of Sociology and Education and the Coordinator of Policy Studies at Teachers College, Columbia University. Wells is the 2016-2017 Wayne Morse Chair of Law and Politics. She will give a public lecture titled Our Children's Burden, How Public Education Helps Sustain a Diverse Democracy on October 18th, 2016. Thanks for watching.